Well, welcome as you're joining us. I know that you're probably still coming in, so I'll just do some meaningless blurb talk whilst you get your webinar set up. I'm Matt Well, by the way, Managing Director of How to Impact, and I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land, home of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is the second webinar from our Food Futures Lab. Our aim in the lab is to explore some of the biggest challenges facing the Australian food system in a way that opens up new thinking and particularly debate. We want to do that to provide anyone involved in food strategies and new tools to help bring some of those really chunky future-facing issues a bit further forward so that we can engage in them. I think we all have generic trends data and lots of information that we can get our fingers on. It's actually, I think, the ability to interrogate those with amazing expertise and experts from different perspectives that I think makes a big difference on that. And we talked last time about how the food system is at a series of crossroads. And today's topic, the price of our obsession with protein, I think brings a lot of those together at the same time, brings them to a head. There's the issue of sustainability and environmental impact. There's the issue of scientific development to provide new food sources, and there's also our lifestyle and our how our lifestyle obsessions are driving changes within the food system. And it's not an exaggeration to say that we are obsessed with protein as a nation. It's really hard to get the exact number, but we're in the top 7 globally in per capita consumption for protein. It's higher if you take fish out. We produce more than 700 million chickens per year. And right now in Australia, there's more than 1 cow and 2 sheep for every human. And obviously we understand, I think most of us, the environmental impact of keeping those larger livestock herds. And our appetite for protein, and particularly animal protein, is not showing any sign of abating. It's a key focus for the fitness industry, for the fast food industry, and new supermarket product launches that feature a protein claim gain anything from a 30 to 60% premium. So I guess one of the questions is, at what point do we, like the Irish dairy industry, decide we've reached peak meat and maybe cap our livestock numbers and start looking to alternative protein sources? We've certainly moved quite a long way down them. Some of our panel here are heavily involved in the exploration of them, from cultivated lab-grown meat to plant-based meat substitutes, which is the Impossible Burgers of the world, to microbial algae, precision fermentation, biomass fermentation, and insect proteins. And we're so lucky to have 3 superb speakers joining us to talk about that. Before I introduce them and get into the content, just a little bit of a heads up and format. We've got some great questions for the panel here, which we'll roll through for the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll collect your questions from the Q&A chat stream. So please put them in there. You can put them in there from the beginning as they go through, and we'll review them as they come up. And if you're really keen on capturing the content afterwards, please don't worry. We will send out afterwards a link to have both audio and visual. So there's a downloadable podcast, and equally just some note form, which is what I was scribbling today as we go through as well, just to get that out today in case it was particularly relevant. But anyway, let's move forward. Let me introduce the panel. We have with us Ryan Pinto, who is a qualified nutritionist who spent over 10 years as an advanced sports dietitian for 4 major NRL teams, Ryan, plus cricket, plus the Waratahs. Before joining My Muscle Chef as head of innovation and R&D 5 years ago. We have Professor Michelle Colgrave, who's the Deputy Director within CSIRO Agriculture and Food, based in Brisbane. Michelle's work seeks to identify key proteins that will benefit Australia's livestock and plant industries and improve human health. And we have Professor Lou Hoffman, who is a Professor of Meat Science. Now, I've got to say, you may never meet a Professor of Meat Science again in your life, so lap it up, at the University of Queensland, and a key member of the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. His work covers a broad range of research topics, with at the moment a specific focus on the potential use of black soldier fly larvae as a food source. So we actually have a bit of a Queensland massive here, because Ryan was just telling us before he was working with the Broncos on their nutrition program, which is, Ryan says, not directly responsible for their recent NRL win, but he's probably just being modest, I'd guess. So
I would
welcome.
like to distance myself from Queensland as a New South Welshman, just putting that up front.
Wonderful. Welcome, panel. So, would you agree we're obsessed with protein? And why do you think we love protein so much? Right, you work in the consumer-facing end, so let's talk about your perspective. Why do you think we as consumers love protein so much?
Um, I think if we put our foodie hat on, it is the premium source of quality and also comfort. So if you go to every restaurant, you scan sort of down the list. When we get to the nicer options, it's always based around protein. It's that comforting, sort of satiating option. From a dietitian perspective, it's such a unique fuel source that not only is sort of it's the main aspect of vitality that a lot of people look to it for. But when we look at sport, it's the key source of recovery and seen as the key source of recovery. So there's probably both a comforting reason and also a functional reason why people sort of hold it on a pedestal.
Yeah. And Lou, obviously, as the meat scientist in the room, you probably understand a lot about the history of our relationship with meat protein. Does it hold a deeper sort of psychological and physiological hold for us?
I think, yes, it definitely does. And I support what Ryan said. But, the way we developed, we have for example, we give off an enzyme called elastase. And elastase in our stomach can only break down elastin, and elastin is only found in meat. So in my mind, meat has always been part of the diet. There's also some historical anthropologists who reckon that our brain really started developing when we started not only consuming meat, but actually cooking the meat, which makes it more readily available for brain development. So I think, the research has shown that as our income, per capita income increases, we tend to move up the scale where we might start with plant proteins, and then it tends to go into meat proteins, and then it goes into the super rich with the super expensive meats. So I think as we go higher, it also becomes a status
Yeah.
symbol. Particularly the type of protein that you consume, it really becomes a strong status symbol as well.
It's also, isn't it? It's part of it. This has a lot of social cues. You were mentioning just the dining aspect, Ryan, but there's a lot around sacrificing animals is a significant gesture in a lot of communities that they say that we welcome our guests and we honor them by taking an animal and we might survive on that animal's milk or its litter. It's actually a big statement to say we will eat that animal. So it's always had a very big social status. Um, Michelle, so what's the cost of that obsession with protein consumption now? And that's I guess it's an individual and a collective cost.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think we have some, I guess, misconceptions out there around protein overall. Like a lot of the time when we are looking at our protein consumption, we're thinking, well, animal protein is the evil. Like there's false statements out around some of the detriments, cancer, linked to cancer and other diseases which haven't necessarily been proven scientifically. But then there's all the questions around environmental impacts. Now, it's very true to say that our animal production systems do take greater land. They have greater greenhouse emissions in particular. But when we think about it, animal agriculture really is the cornerstone of Australia's economy. It supports an immense number of rural jobs and communities. It brings in billions to the economy through exports. And, beef and sheep have been, there's many sayings about riding on the back of a sheep, Australia's economy. And we also know that animal proteins are nutritionally really sound. They're packed with essential amino acids and they have heaps of micronutrients and vitamins like B2, iron, zinc, etc. And those are generally more available than you find in plants, but there's some exceptions to that. And in Australia, actually, we're blessed with our animal production systems being really efficient and also having advanced breeding and really high welfare standards. So, it's not all bad for animal protein, but as I said, there are those challenges around how do we mitigate and minimize emissions from our systems? How do we balance biodiversity in our farming systems? How do we, I guess, reduce the demand on our ecosystems? And what is the opportunity to do that? And that can be through balancing our protein consumption across both animal sources, plant sources, and then the range of what we call novel foods, the things you've mentioned, whether it be from microalgae, insects, microbial-based protein production. All of these are on the table, and what we see them as is a complement rather than an alternative. So this is about saying, well, we know we need more protein globally. We've got a growing population. We've got increasing preferences, as you've just heard about, in terms of wanting to have protein as the centerpiece of our plate. So then it's a question of, well, how do we meet that demand? And I think we have to use all solutions rather than trying to find a silver bullet. And so we'll see that opportunity to have all of these in our diets and on our menus going forward.
Sorry, Lou.
If I can just come in here, I support what Michelle said 100%, but there's another important factor as well, and that's the costs, the economic one. And just as an example, some of my research has shown where when I was looking at chicken and organically free-range chicken versus not, and I was had my students stand at a leading supermarket, and they would ask consumers coming in, if you had a choice, which would you buy? Free range or caged chickens or intensively produced? And they all said free range. And yet then they went into the shop, and unknown to them, I had another student follow them to see what they put in their shopping basket. And it was always the cheaper option, which was the more intensively farmed. So the one is what I call the social response. No one's going to say, I care two stuffs about the environment, about the welfare of the chicken, right? And the other one is the economic reality. Now, we do a lot of questionnaires online, and I think online is more the social responses that we get, and that then leads a lot of the misconceptions that we have out there about proteins. One of the other misconceptions is livestock, ruminants. The reality is in Australia, yes, we have a lot of cattle, sheep, and even a few goats, but the reality is they are raised on areas where we can't grow any crops. The only thing we can use there is that. I would like to see, of course, that to come back to a balanced ecosystem, that we maybe also look at some of our indigenous livestock or indigenous animals and bring them into the food chain. That's what I'd like to see.
So that's a really interesting point. So the opportunity cost of the livestock is not for crops that would have been grown on that land anyway.
Yeah, that's correct.
But there's an argument that says you need to move further down the food pyramid to be economically efficient and biologically efficient in terms of eating plants. That you've used up less energy, world energy, food energy. But we're actually talking about an unbalanced argument that says, everyone talks about cows and sheep farting and burping and methane out into the atmosphere, but actually we're not in Australia talking about the same level of deforestation, which is the cost in other countries for creating livestock paddocks and fields. The indigenous one I think is really fascinating, and I want to come back to that. But of course, you were talking, Lou, about consumer behavior. We've got Ryan, who's responsible for testing products with consumers. I'd love to get your point of view on that, Ryan, as well. When it comes to what Michelle said, was about trying to find that better balance of protein sources. Your business is called My Muscle Chef. What happens when you try and engage your consumers on different food sources, different protein sources to the traditional?
Very, very interesting one. And echo probably thoughts that were already mentioned, but there's a huge discrepancy that we've seen between consumer sentiment to consumer purchase intent. And when you start to, we have a very, very engaged database, and we're probably very lucky that we have a huge D2C brand along with being a big force in the retail environment. But we survey constantly, and often plant-based proteins rank up within almost close to sort of beef or chicken in terms of their sentiment and how they would like to consume that. The reality, or the commercial reality, is that in about 2020, 2021, we launched probably the Australia's first ready meal range of high protein vegan meals. And that flopped with in huge numbers. So across probably 18 months, the purchase behavior did not match the intent. And that's probably the reality of where people like the idea of it, but when it comes to actually putting money on the table and putting their money where their mouth is, they always sort of default to the beef or the chicken options and to a lesser extent seafood and fish.
So what do you know why that is? I mean, do you get to that issue?
Well, yeah, we thought we had so many different types of formats of alternate proteins, whether it be whole food, plant-based offerings, grain-based offerings, even the alternate meat offerings, across different flavor profiles, across different calorie content. We were trying literally everything to make it work because at that time, there was a huge growth in the plant-based culture, and even movies and documentaries like Game Changers and things really brought a light to that world. But it just, when it came down to actual purchase intent or purchase behavior, it didn't mirror the sentiment.
Wow. I mean, that is fascinating because obviously the other part of the puzzle, I guess, is the association with muscle and with fitness. And I think, Michelle, you were talking about bioavailability, about the delivery of protein nutrients straight to the body. As a sports nutritionist, Ryan, do you think we are reaching out to emulate and reflect the behaviors of professional athletes in a way that's unrealistic, or is it actually really positive because we're actually taking better control of our bodies and we're feeding them in a way that's better for our longevity as well as our sort of strength and physical appearance?
Definitely, probably the last 5 years, we've seen quite a significant shift, along with sort of the good and bad of social media. But with COVID, there's been a huge shift to preventative behaviors as opposed to reactive, especially when we start to look at our younger Gen Zs that are coming through now. Um, Athletes themselves, they have very specific diets and very specific requirements. Science has shown that you can get very similar amino acid profiles as long as the diet is very well planned through vegan and vegetarian offerings. If you're looking at the general population who I'd say 95% have never spoken to a dietitian or a nutritionist. The default offering is always easier and more efficient through animal sources as opposed to vegan or vegetarian offerings, but you can plan that to be optimal through a vegetarian vegan. It's just a lot harder, which is why
Mm,
people tend to default to animal-based offerings.
yeah. And Michelle, you were the one who actually told me about the Irish dairy farmers reaching peak meat. Um, is that a fake fallacy? Is that a fallacy for us that we won't reach peak meat in Australia? Will we ever reach peak fish, for example, where we've got the more limited stocks?
Interesting question. So it's peak dairy in
It's
Ireland, I'll
peak
have to
dairy,
say.
that's
So
right,
yeah,
right.
but that aside, it comes from meat derived animals. And I think in Australia we are blessed. We produce far more food overall than what we require for domestic consumption. So we export over 70% of what we produce. So at the moment we're in a positive situation, and that's not across all foods. And in fact, you mentioned fish. So it's an
Mm,
interesting one for both leafy vegetables, which are obviously incredibly important in our diet from a micronutrient and other perspective, and for fish. We actually don't produce enough to feed our domestic populations. And we import something like 90% of our white flesh fish into Australia. So we're actually, I would say, we're probably at peak fish, and we need to adjust that. And obviously, fish is an incredibly important source of nutrition and provides things like the omega-3 oils that you actually don't get from fish, you get from algae, but the fish eat the algae and do the job for us, so that's great. But we get some of those really key micronutrients within some of our fish supplies. So we are actually looking at how do we increase aquaculture, so that's on land aquaculture, production of fish rather than from your wild fisheries,
right.
to adjust and accommodate for some of that demand gap that we have. But yeah, Australia itself, as I said, is pretty well set up for supplying for our domestic consumption, and we export a lot into Southeast Asia and many other jurisdictions. But you'd be talking about, bioavailability. I might just elaborate a little more on what Ryan was talking about. We can get all of the balance of amino acids and nutrients if we have the right diet, or if our food manufacturers also formulate in a way that allow for those to come together. So for instance, if you were to have a diet that is purely based on a cereal-based plant protein, you will lack certain amino acids. Equally, if you went to a purely a legume-based diet, you'll also lack certain amino acids. But when you combine the two of those together, cereals and legumes, they complement each other and actually deliver the full nutritional suite that you need in terms of that amino acid composition. So there are opportunities to blend these different ingredients together in a way that can be a more complete source. But then we also have some challenges in terms of some of the anti-nutrients that exist within plant sources. And so often you may have some nutrients that are lacking because there's something stopping it, that's locking it up in the plant-based source and not allowing your body to access it. So a classic example there is iron and phytic acid. So you have those two that interact and actually stop your body from being able to absorb the iron that you need in your diet. And so we actually need ways in which we either breed those plant-based sources to accommodate what our body needs, or alternatively, we can use food manufacturing and processing to remove the anti-nutrient and allow our body to see the full suite of nutrients that's within the plant-based source.
Right.
If I can come in there, I think one of the challenges is the companies that do the breeding, they're more focused again on the volumes produced rather than the nutritional profile. There has been some good examples though that has rolled out, say in Africa with sweet potatoes, where they've started breeding some that have a key nutrient that was lacking. But it all boils down to the economics. And if I can come back to the fish and aquaculture, and in my mind, it's the same as feedlotting, and we need to start asking ourselves the moral question: is it correct to feed to animals a feed or food that could be fit for human consumption? But I suppose why I say it's economics, we produce a lot of excess proteins in Australia, but there's a cost to get it to other places in the world. And that's part of the problem. Where it's needed, they can't afford to get it there. And that's why I think we have this huge malnutrition and starvation all across the world, because the economics of getting the excess protein to where it's needed, that's what's part of the challenge.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that around also the transportation costs. And earlier, Lou, you mentioned indigenous species. I know, for example, in Tasmania, they've successfully campaigned to include kangaroos and deer that were killed in government or endorsed culls, because obviously they're eating, crops, back into the human food chain, because they're good sources of protein that were being wasted. And I thought it was really interesting when you bring up ethics as well. What's the bigger barrier to bringing in those indigenous protein sources? Is it actually transportation? Because I remember there was the big camel cull in the center, in the red center, and they were flying in helicopters and shooting at camels and just leaving the food, like the potential food there, because it was too costly to transport it to an abattoir. Is it that? Is it the ethics? Because we have a sort of an unnecessary emotional tie to our indigenous animals, which are, they are emblems of Australia? Or is it actually the taste? A kangaroo tail is not everyone's cup of tea.
So if I can start the discussion there, I think it's a bit of all three. So first, the emotional attachment. I think Skippy, the program, remember when some of your viewers might not remember it, but one of the first TV programs was Skippy the kangaroo. And so Skippy the kangaroo became a huggable kangaroo. So that's one of the first one. It's the same research shown with horse meat. If you use horses as a draft animal, you're more prone to see it as a meat source. But if you do it for riding, for sport, then it tends to be more seen as a pet. But in Australia, the big challenge is the distances. And you use the camel, and that's a classic example. The same with the wild boar or the the wild pigs, the feral pigs. And that is, there's not enough value for companies to harvest them on a large scale because the distances they have to move the carcasses. I've had people, and that we've looked at the modeling of what about putting up a camel feedlot closer to where the areas where they capture them. But then you got to get the food there because it's a harsh desert. You can't grow the food for the feedlot. So again, it boils down to the economics. My research in Africa, when I was looking at harvesting of wild animals for human consumption, and I looked at the amongst tourists because there was the feeling that tourists don't want to do that. But funny enough, people who travel, who can afford to travel, are well read, and even there were a couple of vegetarians that answered the questionnaire, and it came down to if it's done on a scientific, proven, sustainable manner, they have no problem with it. And I think that's part of the issue here as well, is the story that if we were to start harvesting kangaroos, we need to get the story out there that it would be done on a sustainable manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I jump in on the kangaroo? Because we've done a fair bit of work actually on this, and we've engaged with New South Wales in particular because they have this exact issue where kangaroos are actually seen as a pest in some of the western regions of New South Wales, and they do need to do humane culling to manage the populations, and so we're looking at, well, rather than, as you say, having that animal protein, which is high nutritional value, go to waste, what are the opportunities? And as Lou pointed out, it all comes down to the logistics of it because you have to have people who are skilled marksmen essentially so that it is humane culling. You need to have the right cold chain storage and it needs to be close to that. Otherwise, the techno-economics falls over in terms of that type of harvest. And obviously, we do have some companies here in Australia who are already utilising kangaroo as a key ingredient in both food and pet food markets. But interestingly enough, we formed up a company called Just Meat. That really acknowledges the benefit of animal protein in terms of nutrients and how that can fit into our diet. And the whole prospect there is to be able to take any protein source, and it's generally lesser cuts of meat that aren't the center of plate option for us, and convert that into a bioavailable protein powder that's shelf stable. And so you don't have the issues of cold chain storage that are required, and delivered it in a form that's flavorless, soluble through some enzyme-based technology. And that means then you've got an animal protein derived protein ingredient that you can use in any form of food. And what I like about it is that you can then think about, well, what are the segments that actually require more protein? So in the general population, it's either going to be females who need the protein, and they may want the iron that goes with it. You've got younger folks as they're developing, and then you've got your aging population. So those who are already suffering from things like sarcopenia or muscle loss and that deterioration that occurs with time. And so you need an increased protein amount within the diets of those folks. And so if you can then deliver a highly nutritious protein source that can be utilized in a range of foods that are applicable to those subpopulations, then it really provides a bit of a unique offering and enables us a way to utilize some of these currently underutilized as protein sources.
And Ryan, I know you're not a marketer. You know you're a nutritionist, and I'm going to put you on in the hot seat. So we're talking indigenous. We're talking about a flavorless meat powder that you could actually drink as a smoothie, I guess, Michelle.
Yeah. A meat smoothie. What could be better?
Meat smoothies. We've talked about your experiment with the vegan range, which went bow. So what's the framing, I guess? What's the successful framing that we need to take on board to tackle these things? Because you said there's just a high premium put on beef and chicken. They're the top two in your ranges. How would you tackle the incorporation of these alternative protein sources, or would you not? Are you just it's a premium product and people expect that? And would it be considered slightly underhand to be boosting your protein numbers through these alternative sources, unless it's actually about the nutritional physiological formula, which is what Michelle was saying a few minutes ago, which is actually when you get the right combinations, you get exponential release of nutrients. What's your commercial hat say?
From a commercial standpoint, it's about the transparency of the product, and it's sort of pulling it up a notch and going, okay, we are eating food at the end of the day, and we want to be able to be satiated. In the world that I live in, it's about convenience and how can you get something nutritious in a very convenient manner. If we were to start to fortify we have our ready meals with powders and things like that, you'd very quickly see a negative attachment to that because people aren't getting satiated from just eating actual substance and eating food. From a nutritional standpoint, I definitely do see a huge opportunity with the likes of the populations that Michelle mentioned who are compromised in the ability to either consume it due to lifestyle or due to physiology. So that's probably where if we've maximized the stimulus when it comes from food and consuming food, then fortification is the next step. And that's probably where I see the introduction of alternate proteins to start to come into society. If you look at other products in the market, alternate proteins play a huge role in having commercially savvy products that have the health halo just because they have protein attached to it. Every single category nowadays has protein in there, and I'm sure at some point we'll have toilet paper with protein on it. So it's one of those things where it's about the transparency of the quality of protein as opposed to just having that word on pack. But the more nutrient dense offerings in every single sort of aisle in the supermarket are starting to use alternative proteins because they are more commercially savvy. And when they're in the likes of a powder or in very small amounts added into a blend in whether it's a protein bar, a biscuit, or a cracker, that's a really easy way to use alternate proteins and start to build up the trust within that, where then it will flow into actual food production, and you'll start to see possibly people alternating beef and chicken with an alternate source of protein.
I think that's a
If,
really good point.
if
Sorry, Lou.
Yeah, if
Go
I
ahead.
can come in there and support this idea of the blend, right? I think when we have these alternative proteins and we're trying to market it as such, as a unique product, that's when we run into trouble. So if I go back historically, in developing countries where we want to have a cheaper meat-based product, I would make, say, an emulsion, and I would include a lot of soya into that emulsion and even insects. So I've had a PhD student where I looked at taking black soldier fly larvae and incorporating it into a meat hamburger. And it was only when I started reaching about 50% of black soldier fly larvae in the cooked meat hamburger that the consumers panels say, no, this is too much. But they were very comfortable with 25, 30%. And if we look at the pet trade, where there's a lot of these alternatives or byproducts going in, none of them, very few of them are the product on its own. They're all forming part of a blend. And I think in the human space as a food, these alternative new protein sources will do a lot better when they come in as a blend and sometimes enhance the blend, but other times to make the blend, the emulsion or whatever it is cheaper as well. So the one is, to high end, and the other is to bring down the costs, because plant-based proteins is a lot cheaper than meat-based proteins.
I think it's a very interesting point, Lou, as well, which is on the one hand talking about powders where you're just using protein as a fortification to a cereal. Obviously, I know a lot of people will look to see what the protein source is, but if it was your meat powder, for example, Michelle, I think people would. Well, actually, do people want to see meat protein in a biscuit? I don't know. I personally would, but I like meat for breakfast. But Lou's talking about insect protein, and then we bring up neophobia and the sense of food feeling disgusting. So that's a really interesting one, which is blended products, is the future of protein consumption sausage shaped? Do we have to look towards, more combinations of recognizable and desirable animal products with these alternative sources? Because I think it's so fascinating that the industry's at this point of going, over here are people turning plant products into things that resemble traditional meat products. There's a second school here who are actually lab growing meats, and it's just a different way of producing those animal proteins, which presumably means you can fortify them in a different way to what you're getting now. And then there's a group where you've got Lou, who's looking at insect fly larvae as a protein source. And then presumably out here, Michelle, people that you've got lots of contact with who are using all these different plant protein sources, precision fermentation. Do we need to keep all those plates spinning? Or do you think some of those have actually got greater viability than others? If you were going to put your money down on one, you three, what would you? I mean, I know it's pretty biased with Lou. He's got his whole life is revolving around black soldier fly at the moment. But where would you go?
Well, I'm just going to not pick one, and I'm going to take a bit of all, because I think that, as I said earlier, I think that's part of the solution here. And they work in together, because, for instance, Lou's black soldier fly, not just Lou, there's plenty of people out there using insect protein. Insect proteins can be reared on undesirable food sources. So, call it food waste, call it production loss, whatever it is, they can be reared on that, and that actually solves part of our problem that we have in Australia, where we have, at least a third of what we produce doesn't make it to the mouth, to the plate, and so there's an option there. Now, then that insect protein source, okay, you might neophobia. I don't want to pull cricket legs out of my teeth, eating a whole cricket. That's not for me. But would I feed my cat a insect protein source? Yes, I would, because they're out there catching them every day anyway. So why not utilize that in their system? And when you ask people, would you eat an insect? They say no. But then would you feed it to your pet? Yes. There's a sentiment there that kind of breaks down some of those barriers. And then if you can then take the side streams that would have gone into pet food production and utilize them to a higher use, so bring them back into food production, then that also creates an opportunity for us to produce more protein, but we're taking a bit of each. And then you've got, as we've said, we've got combinations of plant-based proteins that can come in, and as pointed out, it's not for everyone, but there are people who, for whatever reason, moral, ethical, else, or even dietary, will want to consume those. And then there are things like precision fermentation, which is very different. It doesn't produce bulk protein. It produces specific protein ingredients that are needed for a specific health benefit generally, or perhaps even for functionality, and they will work in with those other protein sources. So I think it's a bit of everything, but all of that requires a lot of processing. And I think there's also we need to balance not only processed foods, but also those raw and closer to source foods within our diet. And there's convenience that is a challenge for that. But I think it's how do we create the right balance across all different protein sources, formats, etc.
That's a really good point. It does all require a lot of processing. And there are some that say that, for example, with the cultivated meat equation, if they're looking at it on ethical lines, you're actually just shifting the issue elsewhere. If, for example, I think they use a high amount of sugar in the labs to grow this, so then we actually should be exploring what's happening to the sugar growing economies, and the for them. But for Ryan, from your point of view, both the nutritionist side of you, we're talking to what Michelle was saying around avoiding processed foods as much as possible, as well as that realistic side, understanding people's prejudices in favor of traditional meats. What's your view on cultivated meats and using that laboratory environment to create a recognizable food that has significant nutritional uplift that normal meat doesn't?
Protein as it stands, and protein-based foods as they stand, is the most expensive element in any sort of meal, or even snack that you would be able to get. So at this point in time, we've done trials with some leading sort of manufacturers working with cultivated meat and seeing how we can work with that, whether it's commercially viable. the sentiment actually was surprisingly um, taken on board quite well, and the purchase intent didn't actually differ once people saw that it did have cultivated meat as opposed to just containing meat. The commercial reality is where it actually fell down initially. So the price of processing that and being able to get it into a meal, whether it be I don't know, a stroganoff or a chicken curry, for instance, was where it actually fell down. So in time, once we can start becoming more efficient, then we can actually start to utilize that. And I think even for the lower socioeconomic populations, that can be a really vital food source where they may not be able to afford animal based proteins. From a nutritional standpoint, I think it's what can we do to elevate our health status from where we are now, and whether it's processed or not. For the top 1%, if I look at athletes where they can purchase anything in the world and it doesn't matter, whole foods will always be the preference for them, no matter whether it's animal or plant-based offerings. But for people who can't afford that and consume that in the amounts that they require, as soon as we get to the point where the processing cost becomes cheaper than actually processing whole animals, then I'm all for it. There's no reason why it can't be sort of rolled out to masses for people who can't afford animal-based proteins. But as it stands, as of 2025, the price of processing is coming down, but it's still not comparable.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is we need to, at the end of the day, put forward a balanced plate of food to people. And you know, as a meat scientist, I don't eat vegetables, for example. I stopped eating them when I was 13. But that doesn't mean everyone else has got to stop eating vegetables. And the other one is, you know, we the plate itself must not only be balanced, but we've got to be able to give a variability in what's in that balanced plate. Because some people might one day go for a protein base that has a lot of soya and the next day a lot of chicken or fish. So, and I find a lot of the marketing is as if it's tackled to get someone to just eat one type, specific type. And we've got to go back and revisit this whole plate idea, because no one eats just meat or just cabbage. You know, it's balanced, and I think that's where the answer for us to go. And that balance would be for a higher income, and it could just as well be balanced for a lower income, balanced on a nutritional basis, but have different ingredients, you know, according to the price.
I thought the other part, Lou, is really interesting in terms of our hierarchy. You know, what do we value most? You talked right at the beginning, top of the shop. We talked about status of premium meats and ritual. We talked about recently, you know, whole foods and whole protein sources. It's harder, isn't it, Lou, with your work where you've got black soldier fly are able to feed on food waste streams, even, is this right? Human waste streams?
Yep.
Yeah. Try selling that back up the funnel. That's, you know, the food waste stream's positive, the human one less so. I mean, you know, we again, we talk about neophobia. I think we start to generally get the heebie-jeebies about that. What do we need to do to upweight that environmental upside of some of these other alternative protein sources?
I think we need to sell the story to the public. And you know, if I look at and it's happening here in Australia. If you look in Sydney at the Hyatt Hotel, where they actually, part of the garage underneath turned into a black soldier fly reprocessing. And it looks good on the eye. So they actually even invite their clients who are staying there and having a meal. So, you know, don't worry about this waste. We're not wasting it. It's going back here, and the end product is black soldier fly. But the other important one is what we call FRUS, which is a good compost, which has been shown, and it's organic. But where I see red lights flashing is what's happened in the insect industry in Europe, because their production costs are high. So yes, black soldier fly can feed on human waste, but they're not going to grow as good or as fast as they would on a more a better waste product that meets their requirements. So already we moved away from where we're using black soldier fly to address a problem, food waste. And now already I see people saying, but if we pre-digest or ferment the food waste, or if we add this additive to it, the black soldier fly is going to go better. But no, as soon as you start doing those, you bring up the cost.
Yeah.
So, instead of looking at it as how much waste per day can we utilize, and the black soldier fly as a byproduct, we're now beginning to look at, let's increase the productivity of black soldier fly. And to do that, we start having to manipulate what we feed. And now we're back to a feedlot system in livestock, isn't it? Let's improve the growth and the amount of meat we can get in a short time period. So we need to start adjusting what we feed the animals. And I think that could be more of a threat to the whole insect industry per se.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about, of course, I'm looking forward. I mean, I'm aware we've got 10 minutes left, have a few questions in the chat stream as well, which I'll get to, is the fact that when it comes to animal protein, we are obsessed with the expensive cuts. But if you go to less wealthy countries, they're eating more of the animal. The offal is more current in the menu. But there are people who will eat it. It tends to be either it's been raised to a gourmet level that's quite required, like a foie gras level, or it's a traditional level. It comes from the cultures that really do that. Is there an angle here we're not talking about, which is more snout to tail? That we need to get if we are growing a full cow, we should be eating 80% of it, not 50% of it as humans. And again, I think it's really fascinating, which is we know that it's Michelle, going back to the nutritional side of those organs, some of them are way better for us than the meat cuts. And then we go to Ryan's side, we're like, yeah, well, you try and tell people that we've swapped the flank steak out of our beef goulash for tripe. I don't think it's going to sell as well. But what's happening to that bit, the snout to tail approach?
So I think it's a really interesting, right? Because I think in many of the emerging economies, they use the snout to tail or whatever acronym you want to use around that. And we do see that complete consumption of all of the protein or other nutrient that's produced. Here we have this, I guess, a cultural expectation that we can eat the premium cuts. And we do use the remaining portions for different uses, whether it be for pet food, into other, like the aquaculture industry, for instance, or else, right? So there are uses. It's just a question of whether they are the best uses and how we can actually uplift some of this. And so that example I gave you earlier around the meat, that was to address the challenge that 80% of the value comes from only 20% of the carcass when we're talking about beef. And so there is an opportunity there to increase the utilization and therefore increase the value and also deliver nutrients to our population. So I think, it's a question of, are you prepared to, like, changing consumer behavior is probably the biggest challenge that we would have. So actually, how do we meet the consumers where they're at? And that may be by taking these lesser cuts or organs or other tissues that we are less accustomed to having center of plate and providing them in a format that makes sense. And that format may be pet food, it may be into a powder or into a blended product. Where the organ itself is perhaps unrecognizable and therefore there's greater acceptance. But yeah, I think we do need to try to maximize our use of everything we produce, because that will then help with our environmental footprint and also help with the food gap that is looming.
Great, thank you. No, I'm going to tackle some of these questions. The first one that came up was to you, Ryan, and it was a question saying, curious to see if you looked at commercial and marketing factors like price, product placement, marketing framing, and wording to influence decisions when you launched your vegan range. I think Michelle just sort of led us into that, saying we really need to position this right. Is it that the word vegan itself has kind of lost value? I know that there is there's some research that shows that when you put plant-based food on a restaurant menu, if you call out that it's plant-based, it's less appealing than if you say, oh, it's a Tuscan bean dish, and you just play up to its provenance. And what sort of research do you do when it comes to that a really interesting issue of reframing.
Yeah, so we even tackled that to a large extent. So from a commercial reality point of view, it was cheaper to produce that range. So it carried a price point that was about 15% less than our current range upon launch. The wording started off with vegan and quickly transitioned to plant-based to be able to trial. It was probably about 9 or 12 months into that range where we made the switch because it was a bit more on the flexitarian spectrum than being sort of hardcore vegan. Product placement wise, again, it was about talking to new ranges, as I guess any company would do when they put their efforts into launching. So that was sort of front and center at the time, and spoken about through various different ways, whether it be in our organic channels or whether it was to curate specific plant-based athletes and influencers that would educate the public and educate consumers on the benefits of that range as opposed to animals. So we did all of the above. The range still exists today, but probably is half of what it started off with. So there's still people purchasing that. But yeah, a lot of those commercial factors were explored just to be able to see if there's something, if there's a trick that we're missing.
Yeah. Um, Brilliant. And one I think I put to both Lou and Michelle, which is what happens to the excess proteins in Australia if it is challenging to export them? So we know that logistics challenge we talked about before. I mean, we talked about the camels just being left, unfortunately, to the carrion birds. What happens to our excess proteins?
Well, it's a big question because protein is in almost every food source, right? So it depends which one we're talking about. If we're talking about like our meat protein, obviously, reaches the domestic market and also reaches out into international markets, and is really well thought of because of the high quality. We have Meat Standards Australia, so a grading system which really is internationally reputed. So there's not usually a shortage of markets that we can access. But if we're talking about things like grain or legume proteins, then they can be stored and remain stable for a period of time. So, as markets change, then we can kind of shift into different export markets that we perhaps don't normally tap into, or we can take some of those protein sources and upcycle them or utilize them in these different ingredients. So there are, I guess we could talk all day about all the different protein sources, but I'll perhaps just leave it there.
Yeah. Final one, Lou, can you be our visionary looking forward? What do you think will change? What won't change in the next 10 years of our protein consumption in Australia? Or
I
what's the risk if those things don't change?
I think we're still going to have this same debate in 10 years' time. But I think meat will always be a core part of the diet, just because of going back to my earlier statement that the reality is there is areas in the world that we can only keep ruminants on. Intensive production systems will be on the increase, more of this factory farming, just because they're highly efficient. And that's why the poultry industry's grown so large. They've done genetic selections for years for birds that don't want to run around and be chooks. So and they're highly efficient in converting plant-based proteins into it. But if the population growth continues, we won't be able to afford to have the intensive animal production systems, because a lot of that protein that we feed to the animals will have to go back rather into the human consumption chain. I think the alternative proteins will become more popular, particularly if it's cost efficient. I was just thinking about one of the earlier questions about the snout to tail. And part of our reality is we've become part of the global village. And with the global village, we tend to consume more and more of the same type of food. And we're losing a lot of our ethnic heritability and ethnic cultures by being part of the global village. So yeah.
So there'll be a homogenization of our approach.
I think so. Yep.
Tim, thank you so much. I think we could safely say we could go for another couple of days, even not just one of the questions. And there are teams of amazing people who are doing just that, researching and dedicating their time to these. And I think to anyone attending, one of the reasons we want to bring these experts in front of you is to give you that sense of there are the people out there who can answer these crazy, interesting questions. It's so interesting. I think that the future of protein is possibly blended. I think that's a blended approach, a blend of alternative protein sources for one, a blend of we will always have to, look at the true animal sources, but actually we might not be a fully animal product. The future might be slightly sausage shaped. And the fact that those powders actually help us fortify and support more compromised or vulnerable members of our community who need that protein, that there's actually going to be a lot more option and choice when it comes to how we provide that protein sources. After this session will end, we'll put up our notes. As I said, there'll be a downloadable podcast and there'll be a video on YouTube. If you go to our website, you'll also be able to find the last one, which is where our palettes come from. It's still available. And in December, early December, we will be talking about the psychology of eating, the impact and the influence of media, environments, and even I guess the supply chain on what we eat. And I think we'll be tapping a little bit more of the kind of the subconscious in this one. We've got some really lovely people from the worlds of media, psychology, and food futurists lined up to speak to you. Everyone who attended today, thank you. But more than that, to the three panelists, Ryan, Michelle, Lou, you are awesome. Thank you so much. We feel so grateful and lucky to have had you speaking with us today. And please keep doing what you're doing. It's great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well and have a good weekend coming up.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks. Bye.